Week 1 is just around the corner. Finally, kickoff returns, helping us break it all down, talk, preview the upcoming 2024 season. Friend of the show, Joe DeLeone, does many different things. The First Team podcast. Also, you probably know him from the Ruffino and Joe Show, one of the up and rising coming up shows you've probably seen. Joe, what's going on, man? Appreciate you taking the time.
Not much. Appreciate you having me on again to connect. And this is finally in a setting where we've got football right around the corner. Last time we talked, it was during the offseason. I'm juiced up, man. It feels like I've been saying this to everyone I've been talking to. I don't know about you, but this feels like it might have been the longest offseason ever. And I know that we say that every freaking offseason, but I don't know why. It feels like there's truth to that. Maybe it's because of all the realignment, all the drama, Nick Saban retiring. I don't know what it was. It just feels like it's been forever since we've gotten some good ball going on.
Yeah, Joe, the realignment, NIL, portal conversations become more and more and more prevalent, which makes us want to beat our head against a wall until finally, the sun shines a little brighter because we've got football on the horizon. Like I mentioned, Joe, I want to start kind of, a little bit different, shifting of gears, if you will. Obviously, you do the First Team podcast. You talk a lot of NFL draft stuff, and you watch a lot of film, do a lot of film study. Who are some guys in the SEC you're excited for in regards to guys you think that could potentially boost their draft stock, or maybe some guys that are under the radar that are going to be, some early round guys? Because I'm sure you know this, obviously, that, it's not the correlation between being a great college player and being a top NFL prospect. It always doesn't go hand in hand, right? So there's some guys that fans probably believe that are going to be top of the draft boards because they're really good college players that probably aren't. And then the inverse, there's probably some guys that fans listen to this maybe aren't as familiar with. They don't realize they're going to be like some of the next dudes that are playing on Sundays for a long time. So is there anybody like that for you on your radar that maybe fans aren't as well aware of that you're excited to follow along this year?
Yeah, there's a couple that popped into my mind immediately. Bunch of transfers, bunch of guys that are in new situations. The first two that I immediately thought of was Deion Burks, who's going to be at Oklahoma this year, new team in the SEC. So maybe some people don't consider them SEC just yet. But Deion Burks and then Trey Moore at Texas are those guys that kind of fit the billing of those that aren't covered enough and haven't gotten enough recognition. There's been a little bit more buzz for Deion Burks, but because their team's new to the SEC and they're new to their teams coming from lesser covered programs, they fit that description for me. Deion Burks is a guy who at Purdue was so explosive after the catch and beating guys over the top. And he had Hudson Card throwing to him, who's a fine quarterback, struggled to get him the ball consistently in places where he could have put up even more production. I think now with Jackson Arnold, a guy that has been hyped up to have a strong career at Oklahoma, who's going to be starting for the Sooners this year, I think that connection is going to be very, very productive in their time this year. Trey Moore, though, who was one of the most productive sack getters this past season in the country, was at UTSA. I haven't heard anyone really mention him. He is super technically refined, not a ton of length for an edge rusher, but he is very technically refined, a very high motor type of a rusher that I think is going to create some serious disruption in the SEC. Two more guys, and I think that these are premier players that we're familiar with because of their recruiting profiles. Princely Umami-Ellen and Walter Nolan. I know that's not exactly a hot take to bring them up, but to answer that question of you're talking about guys who could benefit the most and really rise in their draft stock, they were in situations where it felt like they were halfway or 3/4 of the way developed in their progression. So Princely Umami-Ellen, very bendy, explosive in short area type of guy. And Walter Nolan has just very raw, natural power. But neither of these guys played full speed all the time. It felt like that they were kind of taking reps off. And I think a lot of that went with the coaching of the previous teams that they were at. So now putting them in Pete Golding's defense, I think both of them are going to flourish. And then the last one who I'm super high on, which I feel like not everybody is in love with him, Isaiah Bond, who's now going to be at Texas. I think they're going to use him similar to the way that Xavier Worthy was used this past year. He is very, very fast, and I think he's going to be taking the tops off of defenses. He's somebody who could be in the Biletnikoff conversation by the end of the season.
Joe, you mentioned it does feel like it's been one of the longest off seasons we've had for whatever reason in quite some time. Is there anything as we get to kickoff, toe finally meeting leather? Is there whether it's off season storyline or narrative or talking point? Is there any of those that you're happy to see kind of as we transition from off season to season kind of fade away into the off, like, or at least we can start to get the actual answer to the question that's been pounded in our head the last couple of anything like that? You're like, thank goodness we can stop talking about this in one phrase and we can actually get some answers on the field.
I think the biggest one is how Texas is going to do in the SEC. And this one's such low-hanging fruit because not only is it such a momentous change in the sport that they're joining the SEC, but to their fans' credit, I love those Texas fans. I've got some close friends from my last job. Shout out to the Charity Stripe guys, Josh Fisher, Alex Topoulos, and Nick Kreider, who, they went to Texas, and they used to talk a lot of smack with me when we were in the offices back in the days when I was working for Believe. There is so much hype and so much just build up for them joining this conference, and they're good enough. They're being projected to be possibly in the SEC championship game. We're going to find out really quickly if they can compete when they face off with teams like Georgia this season. And then more importantly, which my co-host Blake keeps pointing out, if they have an off week against a back-end SEC team, we're going to find out if they can survive on a week-to-week basis. They cannot take weeks off. Quinn Ewers needs to be on. Steve Sarkisian's play calling and decision-making needs to be on. I really want to know if they're going to fit or if they're just going to be a team like Nebraska that moved on to the Big Ten from the Big 12 and didn't really fit into that puzzle and has really struggled since they joined a new conference.
Joe, looking at week one, because like you mentioned, we're tired of talking offseason stuff. We got football right in front of us. So let's kind of do like a light overview of the week one slate. Brian Kelly, Lincoln Riley, Billy Napier, Mario Cristobal, which of those coaches most desperately needs a win in week one?
It's easy to say Billy Napier, but I'm going to go Mario Cristobal. I've been super bullish on what Miami's going to do this year, and it always feels like we're saying Miami's back. Are they back to where they are? This is the most talented roster that I have seen them have in just my lifetime of being on this earth and covering and just watching college football. I can't remember Miami having a team that was this good in the past decade. They are on a trajectory with their schedule. I think I saw today, so I think Fox Sports put out a graphic. They've got one ranked opponent on their schedule, which is Florida State, which is insane to think about. There's no reason why they can't finish this year 12-0. And it all starts with how they play in a very, very contentious, deadly environment against Florida. It is really freaking hard to win in the Swamp, no matter how bad those Florida teams are. And a lot of people are just kind of crossing them off and assuming that they're dead in the water. There are always going to be a tough opponent. Like we saw 2 years ago when they knocked off Utah, when nobody really thought that they were ready to do that. They managed to pull out that upset at home. So I really think that Miami has a lot to prove. They need to come out swinging. They need to not only win this game, but I think they need to win it favorably to prove that this team is as good as the expectations are being put out for them.
Joe, there's a number of intriguing games in week one in the SEC. One, I feel like that maybe because I think folks are expecting a little bit wider margin of victory than, say, if this game was played 6 or 7 years ago, is the game between Georgia and Clemson and Atlanta. Do you see any path to that game potentially maybe being a little bit more competitive than folks were expecting? Because, I mean, it's a big game. It's a big game for both sides. Obviously, Georgia-Clemson over the years it's somewhat of a rivalry, if you will, but massive game for Dabo, massive game for Clemson to, I think, on the national scale, maybe start to get back some of the respect that they've lost over the last couple of years, kind of falling off. And, of course, for Georgia, it's setting the tone to make a run at another national championship. But thoughts on that game? Because, again, I feel like that's one that's kind of almost falling under the radar because I think most folks are expecting a 2 or 3 touchdown win in favor of the Bulldogs.
Yeah, I think this game is going to be exactly like when Georgia played Oregon a couple of years ago, and that was on their trajectory towards winning a national championship. That's one of the most dominant defenses in college football history that we saw. I don't know if that defense lives up to that billing, but this offense is one of the most potent that Kirby Smart has had. I think that they are just so effectively rebuilt, and despite all of the injuries in and out of their lineup, Brock Bowers, Zach McConkey, They were one of the best offenses in the country last year. One can only imagine what they're going to do this year. Second year of Carson Beck, second year of Mike Bobo. They're going up against a Clemson team that, look, I get it. Dabo Swinney won a national title, but he has not done effective enough roster management to put this team in a position to compete at the same level that we were used to, as you mentioned, 7 years ago, or even maybe as recent as 5 years ago when they were in the national championship conversation on a consistent basis. I have no idea what their receiver room looks like. They were more aggressive in high school recruiting, but at the same time, are we going to rely on freshmen to generate most of their production? I do give a little bit of grace to Cade Klubnik and Garrett Riley to be better in a year 2 of working together, but this is not a favorable matchup at all for them. If there is any slight hesitation or any slight slowdown during a drive where they go 3 and out, a couple of instances where they're not picking up steam and they're ready to go punch for punch, this game could get extremely ugly very, very quickly. Just again, it feels very similar to how that first matchup for Dan Lanning went when the Oregon Ducks, I believe that game was at the Mercedes-Benz Stadium
Same
too.
Location.
So yeah, this is a tough draw for Clemson that they have to go to Atlanta for this one.
So, Joe, we've touched on Georgia, Clemson. We've touched a little bit on Florida, Miami. The other two big ones, obviously, in the SEC in week 1. Texas A&M and Notre Dame, your boys, the Fighting Irish, and LSU and USC. Which of those 4, which in your mind do you view as the most intriguing game of week 1?
It's definitely that Texas A&M Notre Dame game. Not for just because of my bias of being a Notre Dame.
And by the way, you do a good job of being unbiased, Joe. I know.
I try.
I know Blake gives you a lot of hell for your biases, but I think you do a good job of being unbiased. So
minus me going all in on saying that they could go undefeated this year. That's my one biased take. I get one biased take, but I think that has the most intrigue because of all of the connections in this game, specifically when you look at Mike Elko, who was formerly a defensive coach at Notre Dame, and Riley Leonard was his former quarterback at Duke. That level of familiarity, I think, is going to benefit one side. It's going to benefit either Riley Leonard or it's going to benefit Mike Elko, who is a tremendous coach. But I think this is the most intrigue because Notre Dame needs this as a confidence builder. It feels like in the past 2 seasons under Marcus Freeman, they have lacked momentum. There are a lot of times where they come into these big matchups and they just feel extremely flat. And that's been one of my biggest criticisms of Marcus Freeman is it feels like he doesn't do an effective job of preparing his team on a week-to-week basis to step up to big matchups. He's done it in some games, but not consistently enough. Clemson's a perfect example of that. Louisville's a perfect example of that. They need to come out with so much intensity to win this game because of how hard of an environment that is to play. And I know that everyone took my comments that I made during the offseason and ran with it when I was trying to make a joke, but sometimes you can't control people's interpretation when I said that it wasn't that tough of an environment. But in all seriousness, if they win in one of the hardest places to win against a strong defensive-minded coach and they can actually produce on offense for once in the first game under Mike Denbrock, I think it's going to help them with this light schedule to be on a trajectory to make it into the college football playoff.
Now, Joe, again, your co-host and friend of mine, Blake Ruffino, I know you've talked to him about it, and I've talked about it as well. That game against USC we mentioned on Sunday night in Las Vegas. I think what's interesting, Joe, and I'm sure you guys pay attention to the Vegas betting lines and kind of the trends. LSU, as of a couple of days ago at the time of us speaking, was around a touchdown favorite. That line has come down all the way to LSU -4.5. So the money is actually coming in on USC. What does your gut tell you about that game, and how important is that game for both sides? I mean, I don't want to overemphasize we're talking about these coaches that need wins, but Brian Kelly kicking off year 3. They haven't won a season opener since 2019, and then Lincoln Riley, Joe, a coach, I feel like his candle's kind of starting to burn out, man. It's just they can't play defense. It seems like they're underachieving a little bit. Feels like a pivotal matchup out in Sin City.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense why Lincoln Riley was trying to run from this game because it's a terrible way to start your year when you're trying to build a foundation for success. And there is a lot of questions that need to be answered for USC. LSU, I kind of feel like I know what's coming into this game because we've seen Garrett Nussmeier play a good bit. He's played in the SEC championship game and he played very well when he was called upon. And we kind of know who some of these backup and secondary weapons that they had last year that contributed a little bit that are now stepping into primary roles. I also think that, and Blake's been very bullish on this, that defense is going to be better. It just depends on to what degree. But I feel like USC is one of the biggest enigmas in college football because I have no idea if Miller Moss is actually good because he played really well against a pretty barren Louisville team in a bowl game that really didn't matter. So sure, we can take the context of him looking strong and his throwing and his decision-making was good, but how is he going to do when he's got Harold Perkins bearing down on him and Blake Baker is scheming pressure to get into his face? And then on the flip side of that, I'm really high on D'Anton Lynn. I think he is one of the best defensive coordinators in the country. I think that there are some pieces to work with, particularly Bear Alexander is going to be, I think, phenomenal for them this year with the proper coaching that he didn't get last year. But there's a potential where that defense could get splattered in this game just because of how consistently effective Brian Kelly has been at moving the football in his time at LSU. So, to your point, Lincoln Riley has to at least keep this game close. I know that seems a little bit negative to just assume that they're going to lose this game. I don't think that they're going to win it, but you can't lose by more than a touchdown. Otherwise, there are going to be some creeping haters that are going to be coming around the corner for you.
Joe, outside of those 4 big games in week 1 we spoke of, the opponents for the others include teams like Arkansas, Pine Bluff, Murray State, Alabama A&M, Furman, et cetera, et cetera. So we're probably not going to learn a ton about the other teams, but when you look at the rest of the SEC and you look at the week 1 slate, is there, whether it's a position group, a storyline, an individual player, again, not saying you can draw conclusions, but is there anybody you're just excited to see? We've been talking about them all offseason. You're kind of just curious to get your first look. Is there anybody in the SEC like that, no matter who the opponent is, you're excited to see?
Yeah, I know that Alabama's not really playing anyone in week 1. I think they've got Western Kentucky off the top of my head.
Yeah, the Hilltoppers.
Yeah, real tough matchup that they've got in week 1. But I'm weirdly, if you listened to me last year, you would have assumed that I hate Jalen Milroe. I was critical more of Tommy Rees than I was of Jalen Milroe, and I have been one of Jalen Milroe's biggest fans this offseason because there's so much to work with, and he's such a gifted player that felt like he was being guided in some of the wrong directions because you could see him on the field overthinking, holding the ball too long. There was College Football Film Room put out a really good graphic today that kind of depicted that really well, that he's one of the best quarterbacks in the country last year at producing splash plays, but was one of the worst against pressure and getting the ball out quickly. All of those things really caught up with him. I know that Western Kentucky's not going to really provide much of a challenge, and this is kind of more of an overarching full season thing, but I would love to see how they're going to use Jalen Milroe and how Kalen DeBoer is going to try and orchestrate that offense with him. I think that this is just a combination of two very, very brilliant, a brilliant mind and a very gifted player that could turn out to be very dangerous in the SEC this season.
Joe, sticking with Alabama, are you of the belief that they can just pick it up and keep it going? I mean, Kalen DeBoer is a great coach. I mean, 104-12. The record speaks for itself. He's won everywhere. All he does is win. Are you of the belief they can just pick it up, keep it going? There's no drop off. Again, I've listened to you and Blake talk about this, and obviously, I'm sure there's no bias involved, but Blake believes the GOAT is gone. There's no way Bama can be what they were without Nick Saban. Where do you fall on that? Do you think there's going to be no drop off, some drop off, a lot of drop off? Is it more so a long-term thing versus a short-term thing? Like, again, what does your gut tell you on Alabama football post Nick Saban?
I think there's going to be a slight drop off because they picked, I think, the right guy to be the jumping off point. You don't want to go with a coach who is a roster builder. Like Matt Rule's the first guy I think of as like a roster builder who it takes him multiple off seasons to like really build the team in his vision, in his direction. And Kalen DeBoer, the stops that he's had, Fresno State and Washington recently, it was very quick. It was very fast, flash, success, and then on to the next destination. I think we have no context to know what the long-term success is going to be like because he hasn't done it. But to assume that this year is going to be tumultuous, I think is very short-sighted because we have context of him seeing talented players, knowing how to activate them, how to utilize them, and how to maximize their strengths for on-the-field production. He is, and I know some people hate bringing this up, but or are unwilling to acknowledge this, he is one of the best, if not the best, just in-game coach offensively in the country. He has done so much just in just general decision-making in games and preparedness to beat teams that nobody expected them to beat. The fact that they beat Oregon twice this year, I think, really paints that picture because Oregon on paper was the better team, and Dan Lanning, everybody thought, was the better coach coming into those situations, and they still managed to pull out those games. Same thing against Texas. So I have faith that this year with a Nick Saban recruited team, that they're going to be fine. But year two, after a bunch of your young freshmen and sophomores decided to leave and hit the portal, I don't know what year two is going to be like. I got to be honest, like I don't even know if I have a take yet because I need to see, what they do this upcoming offseason. The future is uncertain, but this year I think 10-2 and maybe even 11-1 is within range for them.
Joe, I think we all know Georgia and Texas are the favorites in the SEC. Ole Miss right up there with that group. Outside of Georgia and Texas, though, because, again, most predictions I've seen have had those two in the SEC title. Who do you think is most well-equipped? I think, again, most people think it's either going to be Georgia, Ohio State. That seems like, and I've heard, again, you and Blake talk about it. That's kind of the matchup we're all sort of, not that we're pulling for it, but it's the two best rosters in college football. It feels like we're on a crash course to get there. But outside of those favorites, do you think there's anybody maybe we're not talking about in the SEC that could be equipped to make a run in the playoff and make the national championship? Is anybody else capable of doing that?
I think Ole Miss is the team that comes to mind, and I know that's very risky to put faith in Lane Kiffin to make a run like that because we don't have really much tangible evidence of him winning a lot of big-time games and then also just being good enough to compete for an SEC title and for him to go on to the playoff. Like, there's a lot of ifs, but this is a really well put-together team. I mentioned Walter Nolan and Princely Umamiel, and I think that defense is going to be phenomenal this year. And then offensively, I'm very high on Jackson Dart. It's so easy to lean on projecting teams with returning starters to be good, and I think that fits this offseason and going into 2024, especially because Jackson Dart, I think, fits really well with what Lane Kiffin looks to do offensively. I think that with Juice Wells and Trey Harris, that passing attack is going to get even better. He just needs to be Lane Kiffin, just needs to, I think, step up in his decision-making and how he approaches some of these big matchups because it seems like they tend to fall short in a lot of those situations.
Joe DeLeone does a fantastic job talking all things college football and NFL draft with the First Team Podcast and Ruffino and Joe Show. Make sure y'all check out his work. Last thing, Joe, and we'll get you out of here. Outside of the SEC, thing you're most excited for from week one, whether it's a matchup, a game, what you're most excited for from week one of the college football season?
Yeah, man, the one matchup I think that I'm like really eyeing is I really want to see what's going to happen. And I know that we kind of already talked about it. I really want to see what's going to happen with that Miami-Florida game. I really think that is such a domino effect for two different teams because if Florida pulls out that upset and they win that game, Billy Napier is buying himself some time, and then the whole world is burning down around Mario Cristobal. And then the other side of this is, as I mentioned earlier, that's a momentum builder. That is a nice statement to start the season against an in-state rival, to start building towards what could be a very fantastic historic season for the Miami Hurricanes. That's the one game I think I'm the most excited for because there's a lot of good matchups. There's a lot of ranked on ranked matchups, but if there's one that could provide, I think, the most drama, it's definitely that one.
Joe, appreciate you taking the time. Hey, let folks know where they can check out all you guys' work.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter or X at Joe DeLeone, and then on YouTube where you can catch all of our live shows. We're live 7 o'clock Eastern Time, 6 Central Time, Monday, Wednesday, and Sundays at Ruffino and Joe Show. If you want to go and check that out, make sure you go and subscribe. Chris, appreciate you having me on. Always a blast connecting with you, and I'm sure we're going to chat again soon during the regular season.
Yeah, we'll do it throughout the season, Joe. You and Blake keep up the great work, and appreciate you taking the time.
Of course.